Imagine you live in 15th century Europe. The world map is full of empty spaces. Large parts of the earth are still completely unknown to humans. Traders, kings and explorers dream of new trade routes, wealth and fame. But only a few years later, one of the largest colonial empires in history emerges, the Spanish Empire, which will extend over entire continents. How could a single kingdom in Europe suddenly rule over vast territories in America and beyond? What consequences did this expansion have for the people who were already living there? And how did this time shape the world we live in today? These are exactly the questions we are going to get to the bottom of today. We travel back to the first voyages of discovery across the Atlantic, experience the conquest of great empires in America, and look at how Spain built its colonial empire, and why it finally collapsed again. But before we start, I have a question for you. In your opinion, which area was the most important Spanish colony in the Americas? Mexico, Peru, or perhaps a completely different region? Write your answer and your reasoning below in the comments. I'm looking forward to your opinions. And if you're interested in history and want to see more videos about great empires, discoveries, and historical turning points, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a new video. Now we travel back to Europe in the 15th century, to the beginning of the history of the Spanish colonies. Chapter 1: Europe before expansion. In the late 15th century, Europe was in a phase of profound change. The medieval world order, which had shaped political, economic, and social life for centuries, slowly began to change. New ideas, new technologies, and new political power structures led to European states increasingly orienting themselves outwards. The desire for trade, wealth, and influence led some countries to transcend the boundaries of the known world. It was in this environment that Spain's expansion finally emerged, which would later lead to the emergence of a huge colonial empire. Europe at the time was not a unified continent, but a mosaic of kingdoms, principalities, city-states, and empires that often competed with each other. Powers such as France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, and various Italian trading cities competed for political influence and economic advantages. Particularly important were the trade networks of the Mediterranean, which had been controlled for centuries by cities such as Venice and Genoa. These cities benefited greatly from the trade in goods from the East, including spices, silk, precious stones, and other valuable goods. Spices played a particularly important role in medieval trade. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, or cloves were extremely popular in Europe. They were not only used to flavor food, but also as a preservative or in medicine. Since these products could not be manufactured in Europe itself, they had to be imported from Asia. The path of these goods led along complex trade routes that reached Europe through the Ottoman Empire, Arab merchant networks, and finally across the Mediterranean. However, these trade routes were long, expensive, and uncertain. Each middleman increased the price of the goods considerably. Therefore, there was an increasing desire in Europe to find a direct sea route to Asia. Such a path would not only reduce trading costs, but also enable huge profits. At the same time, he promised the European monarchs greater political influence. An important trigger for this search for new trade routes was the growing power of the Ottoman Empire. After the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans controlled central trade routes between Europe and Asia. For many European traders, access to these routes has become more difficult and expensive. This increased the interest in finding alternative routes across the sea. Parallel to these economic developments, the political landscape of Europe also changed. In several regions, increasingly centralized states emerged, in which kings expanded their power and gained greater control over their territories. This development was particularly evident on the Iberian Peninsula, where the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon became more closely linked in the course of the 15th century. The marriage of Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469 is considered a decisive step in this development. Although both empires continued to retain their own institutions, their joint rule created a strong political unity. This connection laid the foundation for what would later become Spain. Another central event of this time was the conclusion of the so-called Reconquista. For several centuries, Christian kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula had fought against Muslim rulers who had controlled large parts of the region since the early Middle Ages. This conflict finally ended in 1492 with the conquest of the Emirate of Granada by the troops of Isabella and Ferdinand. With the fall of Granada, the last Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula disappeared. For the Spanish monarchs, this victory was not only a military success, but also an important symbolic moment. The Reconquista had welded the Christian kingdoms together and created a strong self-confidence. Spain increasingly saw itself as an emerging power that was ready to take on new challenges. After the centuries-long war ended, the Spanish crown suddenly had new resources at its disposal. Soldiers, nobility, and adventurers, who had previously been engaged in the battles against Muslim rulers, were now looking for new opportunities for fame and fortune. This group would later play an important role in the conquests of America. In addition to political and economic changes, technological progress also played a decisive role in the coming expansion. European shipping had made great progress in the course of the late Middle Ages. New types of ships such as the caravel enabled longer and safer journeys across the open ocean. These ships were faster, more maneuverable, and better suited to exploring uncharted waters. Navigation instruments also evolved. The compass, which originally came from China, was now widely used in Europe. Likewise, astrolabes and improved maps were used to determine the position of ships at sea. Although navigation was still associated with many uncertainties, long-sea voyages became increasingly possible. Another important element was the dissemination of geographical knowledge. Travelers, traders, and scholars collected information about distant regions of the world. Marco Polo's travel reports in particular had attracted a lot of attention in Europe. His descriptions of the rich trading cities of Asia captured the imagination of many people and strengthened the desire to reach these regions. At the same time, a new intellectual movement developed in Europe, the Renaissance. This epoch was marked by a renewed interest in science, art, and ancient knowledge. Scholars dealt more intensively with mathematics, astronomy, and geography. This knowledge indirectly contributed to the fact that voyages of discovery could be better planned and carried out. While Spain was preparing for the path to expansion, another European country also played an important role in the early voyages of discovery: Portugal. As early as the early 15th century, Portuguese sailors had begun to systematically explore the coasts of Africa. Under the sponsorship of Prince Henry the Navigator, numerous expeditions were organized. The Portuguese developed valuable experience in navigating the Atlantic. They discovered island groups such as Madeira and the Azores and established trading bases along the African coast. Finally, in 1498, the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama managed to find a sea route to India around the Cape of Good Hope. This success clearly showed that new trade routes were indeed achievable. At the same time, he increased the pressure on other European powers to finance their own expeditions. Spain did not want to lag behind Portugal and was looking for alternative ways to gain access to the rich markets of Asia as well. In this context, a man came on the scene who was to change the history of the world: Christopher Columbus. The Genoa-born navigator was convinced that Asia could be reached by sailing directly west across the Atlantic. His idea was based on the idea that the Earth was spherical and that the path across the ocean would be shorter than assumed. Columbus tried for years to get support for his expedition. At first he turned to Portugal, but there his plan was rejected. Finally, he succeeded in convincing the Spanish monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand of his idea. After long negotiations, they agreed to finance his trip. For Spain, this project offered a promising opportunity. If Columbus were indeed to find a new trade route to Asia, the country could gain enormous economic advantages and strengthen its position in Europe. At the same time, religious motivation also played a role. The Spanish rulers saw themselves as defenders of Christianity and hoped to win new territories for their faith. Thus, in 1492, an expedition began, which was originally intended to be just another voyage of discovery. but it led to an event that would change the history of the world forever. Columbus crossed the Atlantic and finally reached land. Not in Asia, however, but on a continent that was previously largely unknown to Europeans. This trip marked the beginning of a new era in global history. Europe came into direct contact with America, and Spain was soon to play a central role in the exploration and conquest of this new world. But before the Spanish Colonial Empire could expand over large parts of America, many discoveries, conflicts, and encounters were still to come. Columbus' voyage was only the beginning of a development that would fundamentally change the political, economic, and cultural balance of the world. Chapter 2: The Discovery of America, 1492. In 1492, a journey began that was to be one of the most momentous undertakings in world history. When the Genoese navigator Christopher Columbus left the port of Palos with 3 ships, few people believed that this expedition would change the known world forever. Columbus himself was convinced that he would find a new sea route to Asia. Instead, he came across a continent that had previously been largely unknown to Europe, and thus ushered in a new epoch in global history. Columbus was no ordinary seafarer. Born around 1451 in the Italian port city of Genoa, he grew up in an environment that was strongly influenced by trade and seafaring. Early on, he dealt with maps, travel reports, and geographical theories. He was particularly fascinated by the idea that the Earth was spherical. This idea was by no means new among scholars, but Columbus interpreted it in a way that led him to a bold plan. He was convinced that the path to Asia was much shorter than most geographers of his time assumed. If you sailed directly west, he believed, you could reach the rich markets of East Asia relatively quickly. Spices, silk, and precious stones would then reach Europe without the many middlemen. For the European monarchs, such a sea route promised enormous economic advantages. But Columbus' plan was initially met with skepticism. Many experts thought his calculations were wrong and believed that the distance between Europe and Asia across the Atlantic was much greater. In addition, the open ocean was a great unknown for most sailors. No one knew exactly what dangers lurked there or how long such a journey would take. Despite these doubts, Columbus tried for years to find support for his project. First, he turned to the Portuguese royal court. Portugal was then a leader in the exploration of new sea routes, but the king's advisors rejected Columbus' proposal. They considered the expedition too risky and instead relied on their already successful routes along the African coast. Columbus, however, did not give up. Finally, he succeeded in presenting his idea to the court of the Spanish monarchs. Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon had just ended the long war against the Emirate of Granada and were looking for new ways to expand their influence. After long negotiations, they agreed to finance Columbus' expedition. The treaty concluded between Columbus and the Spanish crown granted him remarkable privileges. If his voyage is successful, he would be appointed Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Viceroy over all newly discovered territories. He was also to receive a share of the profits from trade and resources. These conditions show how great the expectations were for the possible discovery of new trade routes. On August 3, 1492, Columbus finally set out on 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina. The crew consisted of about 90 men, sailors, artisans, and adventurers. Many of them were unsure whether the trip would succeed at all. The Atlantic was largely unexplored, and no one knew whether there was actually a new route to Asia beyond the horizon. The expedition first sailed to the Canary Islands, which were already under Spanish control at the time. There, the ships were repaired and equipped with additional supplies. Then the most difficult part of the journey began, the crossing of the open Atlantic. For weeks, the sailors saw nothing but water and sky. For many, this situation was unsettling. In a time without precise navigation methods, it was difficult to estimate how far you had already sailed or how long the journey would take. Some crew members began to fear that they would never reach land. Columbus tried to maintain the morale of the team. He reportedly kept 2 different records of the distance traveled, an accurate one for himself and a shorter one for the crew to ease their worries. Nevertheless, The tension on board grew with every additional day on the open sea. It was not until the beginning of October that the first indications of land appeared. Floating plants, pieces of wood and flocks of birds indicated that there must be a coast somewhere nearby. These signs gave the crew new hope. Finally, on the night of October 11th to 12th, 1492, a sailor aboard the Pinta actually discovered land. The next morning, Columbus and some of his men landed on an island that is part of today's Bahamas. Columbus called it San Salvador. For the people who lived there, the arrival of the Europeans was a completely unexpected event. The island was inhabited by indigenous peoples, whom Columbus later referred to as Indians, because he believed he had reached India. This term would later be applied to many indigenous peoples of the Americas, although it was geographically completely inaccurate. The first encounters between the Europeans and the inhabitants of the island were initially peaceful. Columbus described the people in his records as friendly and curious. The islanders brought food to the newcomers and exchanged small items with them. At the same time, Columbus was already looking at the situation from a colonial perspective. In his reports to the Spanish monarchs, he wrote not only about the landscape and the people, but also about possible resources and economic opportunities. He was particularly interested in the question of whether there was gold in the region. After the first landing, Columbus explored other islands in the Caribbean. During this voyage, he also reached the island of Cuba and later Hispaniola, which is now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. This island played a particularly important role in early Spanish activity in the region. During his stay in Hispaniola, however, an accident occurred. The Santa Maria ran into a reef and could not be repaired. From the remains of the ship, Columbus and his men built a small settlement, which they called La Navidad. Part of the crew remained there, while Columbus returned to Spain with the two remaining ships. When Columbus arrived back in Europe in the spring of 1493, he was initially received with great enthusiasm. His reports about new islands, foreign peoples, and possible riches raised enormous expectations. Although he still believed he had discovered parts of Asia, it was already clear that his journey was of historical significance. The Spanish crown reacted quickly to this news. Soon, further expeditions were prepared to explore the newly discovered areas in more detail and to bring them permanently under Spanish control. Columbus himself was to make several more voyages across the Atlantic in the following years. These expeditions led to the establishment of the first permanent Spanish settlements in the Caribbean. At the same time, a development began that was to have profound consequences for the indigenous population. Diseases, forced labor, and military conflicts led to dramatic population losses in many regions. From a European perspective, however, the discovery of America opened up enormous opportunities. New trade routes emerged, unknown plants and animals reached Europe, and the exchange of goods, people, and ideas between the continents increased sharply. Historians later spoke of the so-called Columbian Exchange, which changed agriculture, food, and the economy worldwide. Columbus' voyage in 1492 was therefore much more than just a single expedition. It marked the beginning of a global network that was to shape the economy, politics, and society for centuries. At the same time, it was the starting point for Spanish expansion in America, which would soon lead to the emergence of a huge colonial empire. But the events of the first trip were only the beginning. In the following decades, Spanish explorers, soldiers, and settlers were to penetrate further and further into the American continent. Great empires such as the Aztecs and Incas would be conquered, and Spain would rise to become one of the most powerful colonial powers in the world. The discovery of America in 1492 was therefore not just a geographical event. It fundamentally changed the relationship between continents, cultures, and economic systems, and laid the foundation for a new globally networked world. Chapter 3: The Beginning of the Spanish Colonial Empire. After Christopher Columbus' first voyage in 1492, it quickly became clear that the newly discovered areas in the Atlantic were much more than just individual islands on the way to Asia. Although Columbus himself believed for a long time that he had reached the peripheries of Asia, Spain began to systematically explore, settle and politically control these regions just a few years later. From the first expeditions, a colonial system developed step by step, which would eventually encompass large parts of America. The immediate success of Columbus' first voyage led the Spanish crown to quickly organize further expeditions. As early as 1493, Columbus set off on his second voyage, this time with a much larger fleet and more than 1,000 people on board. Unlike the first expedition, this voyage was not only intended as a voyage of discovery, but as the beginning of a permanent presence of Spain in the Caribbean. Participants included soldiers, craftsmen, priests, and farmers. Their goal was to establish settlements, explore land, and develop economic resources. This second voyage therefore marked the transition from discovery to colonization. One of the most important islands in this early phase was Hispaniola, which is now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There, the Spaniards built one of the first permanent European settlements in the New World. The city of Santo Domingo quickly became a political and economic center of Spanish activity in the Caribbean. From here, Spanish officials organized further expeditions to the surrounding area. Sailors explored numerous islands, including Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and Cuba. These islands were gradually brought under Spanish control. At the same time, Spanish settlers began to farm and extract raw materials. However, the early colonies faced numerous challenges. Many of the first settlers were not experienced farmers or craftsmen, but adventurers hoping for quick riches. When it became clear that gold was not as easy to find as expected, conflicts and problems within the colonies often arose. Relations with the indigenous populations also quickly developed into a central issue. In the beginning, there were sometimes peaceful contacts and exchanges of goods. But as the number of European settlers grew, so did tensions. The Spanish claimed land and resources, which led to conflicts with local communities. Another decisive factor in the development of the colonies was the role of the Spanish crown. Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon wanted to ensure that the new territories were under the direct control of the monarchy. For this reason, Spain began early on to develop administrative structures for the colonies. As early as the beginning of the 16th century, royal officials were sent to the new settlements to represent the interests of the crown. These officials oversaw trade, taxation, and jurisdiction. In this way, Spain tried to maintain control over the distant territories. An important institution during this time was the so-called Casa de Contratación, which was founded in 1503 in the Spanish city of Seville. This authority regulated all trade between Spain and the American colonies. Ships, goods, and passengers had to be registered, and all trading activities were subject to strict regulations. As a result, Seville developed into a central hub of transatlantic trade. From here, expeditions were organized, goods were shipped, and information about the new areas was collected. Maps, reports, and navigation data have been carefully archived to facilitate future travel. While the Spanish presence in the Caribbean was consolidating, European seafarers also began to explore the coasts of the American mainland. Expeditions sailed along the coasts of Central America and South America, reporting on large rivers, unknown landscapes, and numerous indigenous cultures. These reports captured the imagination of many people in Spain. Stories of possible riches, golden cities, and powerful empires spread quickly. Especially among soldiers and adventurers, the desire to take part in new expeditions arose. These men later became known as conquistadors. They were often not official representatives of the crown, but private entrepreneurs who organized expeditions and received financial support from investors. In return, they hoped for a share of the riches they could find in the new territories. The Spanish crown often allowed such undertakings as long as part of the profits were paid to the monarchy. This system allowed for rapid expansion, as many expeditions were privately organized without the state having to bear all the costs. Parallel to the military expansion, religion also played a central role. At that time, Spain saw itself as a Catholic great power. After the end of the Reconquista, many Spaniards saw it as their task to spread the Christian faith to new regions. For this reason, missionaries often accompanied the Spanish expeditions. Members of various religious orders traveled to the new colonies to proselytize the indigenous population. They founded churches, schools, and missions, and tried to convert the local communities to Christianity. However, missionary work was a complex process. In some regions, the missionaries were able to establish stable relationships with local communities. In other cases, religious influence led to conflict, especially when traditional beliefs were suppressed. Another important component of the early colonial structure was the so-called Encomienda system. Spanish settlers were given the right to use the work of indigenous communities. In return, they were to protect these people and educate them to Christianity. In practice, however, this system often led to exploitation and forced labor. Many indigenous communities have been forced to work in mines or on plantations. At the same time, diseases spread that were introduced by the Europeans and against which the indigenous population had no immunity. These developments led to dramatic population declines in many regions. Within a few decades, millions of people died of diseases such as smallpox, measles, or flu. This catastrophe profoundly changed the social structures of American societies. Meanwhile, the importance of the colonies for Spain continued to grow. New crops and products arrived in Europe, including corn, potatoes, and cocoa. At the same time, Spanish settlers began to grow agricultural products for export. The Caribbean thus developed into an important base for Spain's further expansion. Expeditions started from these islands, which eventually led to the American mainland. The Spanish colonies became the starting points for new conquests and discoveries. The Spanish Empire also gained increasing political importance. By controlling new territories and trade routes, Spain was able to expand its influence in Europe. Precious metals and other resources from the colonies would later play a central role in the European economy. The beginning of the Spanish colonial empire was therefore not a single event, but a gradual process. From the first settlements in the Caribbean, a complex system of administration, trade, missionary work, and military expansion developed. This early phase laid the foundations for everything that was to follow. In the coming decades, Spanish expeditions would encounter powerful empires in Central and South America. The encounters between these worlds were to lead to dramatic conflicts, cultural changes, and profound historical upheavals. The Spanish colonial empire was only at the beginning of its development, but it was already becoming apparent that its effects would reach far beyond the borders of Europe and America. Chapter 4: The Conquest of Mexico. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Spaniards had already taken control of several islands in the Caribbean. From these bases, they began to advance further and further into unknown regions. Reports of rich cities and powerful empires in the American mainland quickly spread among Spanish settlers and adventurers. One region in particular attracted a lot of attention: the area of present-day Mexico, where there was a powerful empire that Europeans later referred to as the Aztec Empire. At the center of this empire was the capital Tenochtitlan, an impressive metropolis built on islands in Lake Texcoco. With its temples, palaces, markets, and canals, it was one of the largest cities in the world of its time. It is estimated that more than 200,000 people lived there. The Aztec Empire was politically well organized and controlled large parts of Central America through a network of alliances and tribute. At the head of this empire was the ruler Moctezuma II, who ruled over a complex system of nobility, priests, warriors, and officials. The power of the Aztecs was based not only on military strength, but also on economic control. Subjugated regions regularly had to deliver tributes in the form of food, textiles, or precious metals. The encounter between Spain and the Aztec Empire began in 1519. In that year, the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés set off from Cuba on an expedition to the American mainland. Cortés was originally a lawyer and adventurer who sought wealth and fame in the Spanish colonies. His expedition consisted of about 600 soldiers, a few cannons, and a few horses. Compared to the huge armies of the Aztec Empire, this force was extremely small. Nevertheless, the Spaniards had some decisive advantages: steel weapons, firearms, military experience from European wars, and above all, a strategy based on alliances with local groups. When Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico, he first began to make contact with various indigenous communities. In doing so, he received an important support, an interpreter named Malinche, also known as Dona Marina. She spoke several local languages and was able to mediate between the Spanish and the indigenous peoples. Malinche played a central role in the diplomatic contacts and negotiations of the Spaniards. Through her translations and her knowledge of the political situation in the region, Cortés was able to gather important information and make strategic decisions. As Cortés moved inland, he encountered various peoples who had to pay tribute to the Aztec Empire. Some of these groups saw the Spaniards as possible allies against the power of the Aztecs. Particularly important was the alliance with the Tlaxcaltecs, a people who had long been in conflict with the Aztecs. This alliance changed the balance of power considerably. While Cortés had only a few hundred Spanish soldiers at his disposal, he could now rely on thousands of local warriors to support his expedition. Some legends were later interpreted as if some people believed that the Spaniards could be associated with divine prophecies. However, historians still debate the extent to which such ideas actually played a role. In November 1519, Cortés and his allies finally reached Tenochtitlan. The city made a deep impression on the Spaniards. Wide streets, large temples, and a huge market with thousands of merchants showed the prosperity and organization of the Aztec Empire. Moctezuma initially received Cortés peacefully and allowed the Spaniards to stay in the city. This decision would later prove to be momentous. Cortés used the opportunity to influence the political situation in his favor. Soon, the Spaniards practically captured Moctezuma and tried to exert control over the empire through him. This situation led to increasing tensions between the Spaniards and the population of the city. In his absence, the situation in the capital escalated. Spanish soldiers attacked a group of Aztec nobles during a religious festival, leading to a major riot. When Cortés returned, the city was already in open conflict. The situation became increasingly dangerous for the Spaniards. Eventually, they were forced to leave Tenochtitlan. On the night of June 30th, 1520, they tried to flee the city, an event that later became known as La Noche Triste. Many Spanish soldiers and their allies were killed during this flight. Despite this serious setback, Cortés did not give up. He withdrew with his remaining troops and began to develop a new strategy. Once again, the support of indigenous allies played a decisive role. Another factor that changed the course of the conflict was the spread of disease. In particular, smallpox, which had been introduced by Europeans, spread quickly in the region. Since the indigenous population had no immunity to this disease, many people died within a short time, including important leaders. This epidemic significantly weakened the Aztecs' defenses. At the same time, Cortés was preparing a new offensive. With a large army of Spanish soldiers and thousands of indigenous allies, he began the siege of Tenochtitlan. The siege lasted several months and was marked by heavy fighting. The Spaniards destroyed bridges, blocked supply routes, and systematically attacked the city. In August 1521, Tenochtitlan finally fell after long battles. The once powerful capital was largely destroyed. With their fall, the political power of the Aztec Empire also ended. After the conquest, the Spaniards began to build a new colonial capital on the ruins of the old city, Mexico City. This city soon became the political center of Spanish rule in Central America. The conquest of Mexico was a turning point in the history of Spanish expansion. It showed that relatively small European expeditions were able to defeat large empires, mainly through alliances with local groups, military technology, and the effects of imported diseases. For the indigenous population, however, this conquest had dramatic consequences. Political structures were destroyed, traditional religion suppressed, and many communities lost their independence. At the same time, a new phase of colonial administration began, in which Spain tried to control the conquered territory economically and politically. However, the conquest of Mexico was only the beginning of further expansion. News of Cortés' success spread quickly throughout the Spanish world, inspiring other conquistadors to embark on new expeditions. Soon their eyes turned to another powerful empire in the south of the continent, the Empire of the Incas. This marked the beginning of the next chapter of Spanish expansion in America. Chapter 5: The Conquest of the Inca Empire. While the news of Hernán Cortés' conquest of the Aztec Empire caused a stir in the Spanish world, many adventurers were already turning their attention to new regions of the American continent. Reports from travelers and merchants told of another great empire in the south that was supposed to have enormous riches. This empire was the Empire of the Incas, which stretched over large parts of the Andes and was one of the largest political entities in America before the arrival of Europeans. The Inca Empire, which was called Tawantinsuyu by its inhabitants, stretched along the Andes for thousands of kilometers. It included areas of present-day Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Chile, and parts of Argentina. The center of the empire was the city of Cusco, which was considered the religious and political heart of the empire. The Incas had built up a remarkable administrative system. Although they did not have a script in the European sense, they organized their empire with the help of a complex network of officials, streets, and warehouses. An extensive road system connected the various regions of the empire with each other. These roads could be used to transport messages, goods, and troops quickly. At the head of the empire was the Inca ruler, who was considered the divine representative of the sun. The population was involved in a highly structured system of work obligations. Communities regularly had to perform work for the state, for example in the construction of roads, terraced fields, or temples. Despite this impressive organization, the Inca Empire was in a difficult phase at the beginning of the 16th century. Shortly before the arrival of the Spaniards, a bitter civil war had broken out. Two princes fought for control of the empire, Atahualpa and his brother Huáscar. This conflict weakened the empire considerably. After years of fighting, Atahualpa finally prevailed and took control of the empire. But the war had destabilized many regions and claimed numerous lives. It was precisely in this situation that the first news of strange men from the north reached the Andes region. These men were led by the Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro. Pizarro was a seasoned adventurer who had already undertaken several expeditions along the South American coast. Like many other conquistadors, he hoped to find wealth and fame in the new territories. In 1532, Pizarro led a small expedition into the territory of the Inca Empire. His force was surprisingly small. Less than 200 Spanish soldiers accompanied him. But similar to the conquest of Mexico, the Spaniards had some decisive advantages, including steel weapons, firearms, horses, and military experience. When Pizarro and his men advanced inland, he heard that the Inca ruler Atahualpa was in the city of Cajamarca. There, Atahualpa was celebrating his victory in the Civil War. Pizarro realized that this could be an opportunity to meet the ruler directly. The Spaniards invited Atahualpa to a meeting. The Inca ruler appeared with a large following, but his companions were mostly unarmed. Atahualpa apparently did not expect that the small group of foreign soldiers could pose a serious threat. What followed was one of the most dramatic moments in colonial history. The Spaniards had prepared an ambush. When the meeting began, they suddenly attacked, cannons fired, horsemen rushed through the crowd, and Atahualpa's surprised companions panicked. Within a short time, the Spaniards succeeded in capturing the Inca ruler. Thousands of his supporters were killed in the attack. For the Inca Empire, this capture was a heavy blow, because the political structure of the empire was strongly oriented towards the person of the ruler. Atahualpa quickly realized that his imprisonment was a difficult situation. In order to gain his freedom, he offered the Spaniards an extraordinary ransom. He promised to fill one room with gold up to the height of his outstretched hand, and 2 other rooms with silver. The Spaniards accepted this offer. In the following months, Inca subjects brought large quantities of gold and silver objects from different regions of the empire to Cajamarca. Temple decorations, statues, and artistic objects were melted down to fulfill the ransom. However, despite this enormous payment, Atahualpa was not released in the end. The Spaniards feared that he could continue to exert influence on his supporters. In 1533, he was executed after a controversial trial. With the death of Atahualpa, the Inca Empire lost its central ruler. Pizarro and his men took advantage of the political uncertainty to advance further into the empire. They first installed a new Inca ruler to work with them. Shortly afterwards, the Spaniards marched into the capital Cusco. The city was plundered, and numerous temples and palaces were destroyed or rebuilt. Many buildings later served as the basis for new Spanish buildings. Although the Spanish controlled important cities, the Inca Empire was not yet completely defeated. In the following years, there were several uprisings against Spanish rule. Some Inca leaders retreated to remote regions of the Andes and tried to organize resistance. The resistance became particularly well known under Manco Inca Yupanqui, who had initially ruled as a ruler installed by the Spanish, but later led a major uprising. His troops even besieged the city of Cusco for a time. Despite these efforts, the Spaniards were able to expand their control in the long term. Due to military superiority, alliances with local groups, and the spread of European diseases, many resistance movements lost strength. The Spaniards founded new cities and administrative centers. A particularly important foundation was the city of Lima, which Pizarro had built in 1535 on the coast of Peru. Lima later developed into the political center of Spanish rule in South America. With the conquest of the Inca Empire, Spain gained access to enormous resources. The rich silver deposits in the Andes became particularly important, which would later play a central role in the economy of the Spanish Empire. At the same time, a profound social change began in this region as well. The traditional political order of the Incas was destroyed, and new colonial structures emerged. Spanish settlers were given land and labor, while missionaries tried to convert the indigenous population to Christianity. As in other parts of the Americas, diseases led to dramatic population losses. Many indigenous communities were additionally burdened by forced labor in mines or on plantations. The conquest of the Inca Empire marked another decisive step in the expansion of the Spanish colonial empire. Within a few decades, Spanish conquistadors had defeated two of America's greatest empires and brought large parts of the continent under their control. But the military conquest was only the beginning of the next phase, the organization and administration of these vast territories. Spain now had to find ways to govern a colonial empire that was thousands of miles away and consisted of numerous different regions. To overcome this challenge, the Spanish crown developed a complex administrative system to ensure control over the new territories. It is precisely this organization of the colonial empire that the next chapter deals with. Chapter 6: Administration of the Colonial Empire. After Spain had brought large parts of Central and South America under its control within a few decades, the Spanish crown faced a formidable challenge. The newly conquered territories were thousands of kilometers away from Europe, encompassing vast landscapes with different cultures and millions of people. In order to control these regions permanently, a complex administrative system had to be created. Thus, in the course of the 16th century, a political structure emerged that was to organize the Spanish colonial empire over several centuries. The basis of this administration was the close connection between the colonies and the Spanish monarchy. Unlike some other European powers, Spain did not regard its overseas territories as independent trading colonies, but as a direct extension of the kingdom. Theoretically, the new territories belonged to the Spanish king, and their inhabitants were considered subjects of the crown. An institution in Spain itself played a central role in the organization of colonial policy, the Consejo de Indias. This so-called India Council was established in the early 16th century and was responsible for almost all political decisions regarding the colonies. The council advised the king on administrative, legislative, and judicial issues. He decided on appointments of important officials, reviewed reports from the colonies, and developed new rules for trade and government. Although the colonies were geographically far apart, the Spanish crown tried to exercise the most direct control possible through this institution. At the same time, there was another important authority, the Casa de Contratación in Seville. This institution was responsible for all trade between Spain and the American colonies. All ships that crossed the Atlantic had to be registered here. Goods, passengers, and even maps were strictly controlled. Through this system, Spain wanted to ensure that the economic benefits of the colonies mainly benefited the Spanish crown. At the same time, it was intended to prevent other European powers from gaining access to America's resources. But administration in Spain alone was not enough to control such a large empire. Therefore, the crown itself created a hierarchical administrative structure in America. The largest administrative units were called viceroyalty. One of the first and most important of these territories was the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which was founded in 1535. This viceroyalty included large parts of Central America, Mexico, and later also areas in what is now the southwest of the United States. At the head of such a viceroyalty was a viceroy who acted as the personal representative of the Spanish king. The viceroy had far-reaching powers. He was responsible for administration, military defense, economic policy, and law enforcement. The viceroys were appointed directly by the Spanish crown and mostly came from the European nobility. Their term of office was limited, and upon their return to Spain, they often had to give a detailed report on their time in office. In this way, the crown tried to prevent abuse of power. In addition to the viceroy, there were other important administrative levels. A particularly important organ were the so-called audiencias. These institutions functioned as the highest courts in the colonies, but also had administrative tasks. The members of these courts supervised the work of local officials and were able to review decisions of the viceroy. This created a system of checks and balances to prevent individuals from accumulating too much power. Below this level, the colonial empire was divided into smaller administrative units. Provinces and cities were administered by governors or local officials, who also acted on behalf of the Spanish crown. The so-called cabildos, i.e. city councilors, also played an important role. These institutions were responsible for local administration and took care of tasks such as urban planning, public order, and economic affairs. In many cities, local elites had great influence on these councils. Over time, a new social group developed within colonial society, the Creoles. These were people of Spanish descent, but who were born in America. Although they were culturally closely linked to Spain, they often had less political influence than civil servants who came directly from Europe. Over time, this inequality led to tensions within colonial society. Many Creoles felt disadvantaged by the Spanish crown, as important offices were often given to people from Spain. Another important part of colonial administration was control over land and resources. After the conquest, large areas were redistributed. Spanish settlers were given land ownership, while indigenous communities often lost their traditional territories. In order to organize the economic use of the colonies, Spain introduced various labor and tax systems. The so-called Encomienda system, in which Spanish settlers were given the right to use the labor of indigenous communities, became particularly well known. Officially, the encomenderos, i.e. the Spanish landowners, were supposed to provide the protection and religious instruction of the indigenous population in return. In reality, however, this system often led to exploitation and forced labor. Over time, the Spanish crown tried to limit such abuses. In 1542, for example, the so-called new laws were enacted, which were intended to limit the abuse of the Encomienda system. However, these reforms often met with resistance among Spanish settlers, who did not want to lose their economic privileges. In addition to economic and political structures, the church also played an important role in the administration of the colonies. Missionaries founded churches, schools, and missions in many regions of America. They were not only responsible for religious tasks, but often also for education and social organization. Some clerics even actively campaigned for the protection of the indigenous population. One of the best-known representatives of this movement was Bartolomé de las Casas, who sharply criticized the treatment of indigenous people by Spanish settlers. His reports on violence and exploitation led to intense debates in Europe about the moral responsibility of colonial rule. These discussions are among the earliest examples of an international debate on human rights. Despite such criticism, the Spanish colonial system remained stable for a long time. Through a network of officials, military, church, and economic institutions, Spain managed to maintain control over its American possessions. The colonies increasingly developed into important economic centers. Cities grew, trade routes emerged, and more people emigrated from Europe to America. At the same time, a new society emerged in which European, indigenous, and African influences merged. But this complex management system also brought new problems. Corruption, power struggles, and economic inequalities were widespread in many regions. In addition, the enormous distance between Spain and America continued to pose a major challenge. Despite these difficulties, the Spanish crown managed to rule one of the largest colonial empires in history for several centuries. The administration of the empire formed the backbone of Spanish power in America. But political control alone was not enough. In order for the colonial empire to exist in the long term, it also had to function economically. Therefore, the economic development of the colonies played a decisive role in Spain's success. It is precisely this economic basis of the Spanish colonial empire that the next chapter deals with. Chapter 7: Economy of the Colonies. With the conquest of large parts of the Americas, Spain had not only gained new territories, but also gained access to enormous economic opportunities. For the Spanish crown and many settlers, the economic exploitation of the colonies was one of the most important reasons for expansion. Agriculture, mining, and trade quickly developed into central components of the colonial system. These economic activities not only changed America, but also influenced the economy of Europe and the entire world. At the beginning of the Spanish colonial era, many Europeans hoped for one thing above all: gold. Stories of rich cities and immeasurable treasures had already spread in Europe early on. When the first expeditions to America set off, many adventurers dreamed of finding great wealth quickly. In fact, Spanish conquistadors found gold in some regions, especially in rivers or as part of religious objects and jewelry. But it soon became clear that the really important resources of the colonies were not only in gold, but above all in silver. Large silver deposits were later to become one of the most important economic foundations of the Spanish Empire. One of the most important places for silver mining was the city of Potosí in today's Bolivia. There, Spanish colonists discovered huge silver deposits in the Cerro Rico mountain, the Rich Mountain, in 1545. Within a few years, Potosí developed into one of the largest cities in the world. Tens of thousands of people lived and worked there to extract the coveted metal. However, silver mining in Potosí was associated with enormous human costs. Many indigenous workers were forced to work in the mines. The work underground was dangerous, and many people died of accidents, illnesses, or exhaustion. Despite these risks, the demand for labor remained high as silver mining promised huge profits. Another important center of mining was established in the area of present-day Mexico, especially in the city of Zacatecas. Large silver deposits were also discovered there, which contributed to the economic development of the region. The silver from America played a central role in international trade. Large quantities of the precious metal were transported to Spain and from there traded on to other parts of Europe and even to Asia. Trade with China was particularly important, as silver was an important means of payment there. To organize this trade, Spain developed a tightly controlled system of trade routes. Ships that sailed between Spain and America were organized into so-called fleets. These fleets sailed across the Atlantic at regular intervals, transporting goods, people, and precious metals. An important port on the American side was the city of Veracruz, from which goods were shipped to Europe. On the Spanish side, the port of Seville played a central role. There, the goods were registered, taxed, and redistributed. In addition to mining, agriculture was also an important part of the colonial economy. Spanish settlers introduced new crops and agricultural techniques to America. At the same time, they began to build up large farms. Many of these businesses were organized as so-called haciendas. These were large estates on which various products were grown. These included, for example, wheat, sugarcane, or cattle. Sugar cultivation in particular developed into an important source of income in some regions. However, agriculture also led to major changes for the indigenous population. Traditional land use systems have often been displaced, and many communities have lost their land to Spanish settlers. Another important element of the colonial economy was trade within America itself. New trade networks emerged between different regions. Cities developed into important trading centers where goods from different parts of the continent came together. The capital of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, Mexico City, became particularly important. This city developed into an important economic center where merchants, craftsmen, and civil servants lived and worked. In South America, too, an important economic center emerged in the city of Lima, which became the political and economic center of the Viceroyalty of Peru. From there, many trading activities were organized, especially the transport of silver from the Andean regions. In addition to European and indigenous workers, another group also played an important role in the colonial economy: enslaved people from Africa. As the indigenous population declined sharply in many regions due to disease and harsh working conditions, Spanish colonists increasingly began to bring African workers to the Americas. These people were transported across the Atlantic under extreme conditions and often had to work on plantations or in mines. The transatlantic slave trade became an important part of the colonial economy. At the same time, the connection between Europe, Africa, and America brought with it a far-reaching exchange of plants, animals, and technologies. This exchange is now often referred to as a Columbian exchange. New plants from America changed the diet of many people worldwide. Corn, potatoes, and tomatoes in particular later became important components of European cuisine. Conversely, Europeans brought animals such as horses, cattle, and sheep to America, which also had a major impact on agriculture and society there. New trade routes were also created by the Spanish colonial economy. Particularly noteworthy was the connection between America and Asia across the Pacific. From the Mexican coast, Spanish ships regularly sailed to Manila in the Philippines. This route, which became known as the Manila Galleon trade, connected the American colonies with the markets of Asia. Silver from Mexico was exchanged for Asian goods such as silk, porcelain, and spices. These products then made their way to Europe. These trade links created a global economic system that connected several continents. Spain played a central role as a mediator between America, Europe, and Asia. But despite the enormous wealth from the colonies, Spain also had economic problems. A large part of the silver was used to finance wars in Europe or to pay debts. In addition, the strong influx of precious metals led to inflation, i.e., rising prices, within Spain. Many historians therefore argue that Spain benefited less economically from its colonies in the long term than initially expected. While large quantities of silver flowed into Europe, the Spanish economy itself developed only to a limited extent. In the colonies, on the other hand, a complex society emerged that was strongly influenced by economic activities. Mining, agriculture, and trade determined the everyday life of many people. At the same time, these economic structures led to great social inequalities. Spanish elites often controlled land, resources, and trade, while indigenous communities and enslaved people had to do much of the work. These inequalities would later play an important role in social tensions and political conflicts. Despite all the problems, the colonial economy remained stable for many decades. Silver mines, merchant fleets, and farms ensured that Spain was able to maintain its position as one of the most powerful colonial powers in the world. But economic structures alone do not explain all life in the colonies. In addition to mining, trade, and agriculture, a diverse society with its own social hierarchies, cultures, and identities also developed. How this colonial society was structured and which groups played a role in it is the focus of the next chapter. Chapter 8: The Encomienda System and Forced Labor. With the expansion of the Spanish colonial empire in America, a central question quickly emerged: who should do the work necessary to build cities, operate mines, and manage plantations? The Spanish colonies needed enormous amounts of manpower. At the same time, many of the European settlers were unwilling or unable to do this physically hard work themselves. This field of tension developed into one of the most formative systems of the early colonial period, the so-called Encomienda system. The Encomienda was originally intended as a kind of administrative and work organization. The Spanish crown granted certain settlers, so-called encomenderos, the right to use the labor of indigenous communities. In return, these settlers were to take responsibility for the people assigned to them. Officially, this included the protection of the population, their religious instruction in the Christian faith, and a certain level of care. The theory behind this system presented it as a kind of mutual obligation. The indigenous population was to work and pay tributes, while the Spanish encomenderos were to ensure order, security, and religious care. In practice, however, this system often developed into a form of forced labor. Many encomenderos exploited their position of power and demanded ever greater work performance. Indigenous men were forced to work in fields, erect buildings, or work in mines. Mining in particular demanded hard physical work under dangerous conditions. The impact on the indigenous population was severe. In many regions, people had to travel long distances to get to their places of work. Families were torn apart, and traditional ways of life came under increasing pressure. Communities that had previously organized their own agricultural and social systems increasingly lost their self-determination. A particularly difficult area was mining. In the silver mines of the Andes or in the gold regions of Central America, workers often had to work under extreme conditions. Dark tunnels, toxic fumes, and unstable tunnels led to numerous accidents. Many people fell ill or died due to the harsh working conditions. In addition to this forced labor, there was another factor that dramatically worsened the situation of the indigenous population: diseases. European sailors and settlers brought diseases such as smallpox, measles, and flu to America. Since the indigenous population had no immunity to these diseases, epidemics spread rapidly. Within a few decades, there were massive population declines in many regions. Historians assume that in some parts of America, up to 90% of the original population died. This catastrophe had a profound impact on the social and economic structures of the colonies. Paradoxically, the sharp decline in the population led to an even greater increase in the demand for labor. Spanish settlers were looking for new ways to maintain their economic activities. In some regions, the Encomienda system has therefore been further expanded, although criticism of its consequences has already been voiced. One of the most important voices against the mistreatment of the indigenous population was the Dominican monk Bartolomé de las Casas. He had spent some time in the colonies himself and had witnessed the harsh conditions in which many people had to work. Las Casas wrote several reports on the treatment of the indigenous population and openly criticized the violence and exploitation by Spanish settlers. In his writings, he argued that indigenous peoples were just as much human beings with rights and dignity as Europeans. His texts caused intensive discussions in Spain. Some scholars and politicians began to question the moral foundations of colonial policy. A debate that took place in the 16th century and is considered one of the first major discussions on human rights in history became particularly important. In this debate, different positions were opposed. Some argued that Spanish rule was necessary to spread order and the Christian religion. Others, including Las Casas, stressed that violence and coercion are incompatible with Christian values. In response to these discussions, the Spanish crown tried to introduce reforms. In 1542, the so-called New Laws were passed. These laws were intended to limit the abuse of the Encomienda system and strengthen the rights of the indigenous population. Among other things, the reforms stipulated that encomiendas could not be inherited permanently and that particularly severe forms of exploitation were to be banned. In practice, however, the implementation of these laws has been difficult. Many Spanish settlers resisted the new rules because they saw their economic interests threatened. In some regions, there were even open uprisings against the reforms. The Spanish crown therefore had to compromise and weaken some of the measures. Nevertheless, the new laws marked an important step in the development of colonial politics. Parallel to these developments, other forms of work organization also emerged. Especially in the Andean regions, a system was introduced that tied in with earlier traditions of the Inca Empire. This system was called mita, and required indigenous communities to regularly provide labor for state projects. Although this system was partly based on pre-existing traditions, it was often intensified under Spanish rule. Many workers had to spend long periods of time in mines or other work projects, which again led to heavy burdens. Since the indigenous population declined sharply in many regions, colonial rulers also began to import workers from Africa. Enslaved people were transported across the Atlantic and employed in various areas of the colonial economy. Especially on plantations and in some mining areas, these workers played an important role. The transatlantic slave trade thus developed into an important part of the colonial economy. The various forms of forced labor strongly shaped the social fabric of the colonies. Different groups had very different living conditions. While some Spanish settlers gained large landholdings and economic power, many indigenous communities and enslaved people lived in difficult circumstances. Despite these inequalities, new forms of coexistence also emerged in the colonies. People from different backgrounds met in cities, at markets, and in working groups. As a result, a society developed that consisted of many cultural influences. The Encomienda system and other forms of forced labor were among the most formative elements of this colonial world. They influenced not only the economy, but also the social relations and political structures in the colonies. The consequences of these systems were felt in the long term. They left deep scars on American societies and helped create social inequalities, some of which continue to the present day. At the same time, a complex social hierarchy developed within these societies, in which origin, ancestry, and cultural affiliation played an important role. Spaniards, Creoles, mestizos, indigenous people, and people of African descent lived in a system that was strongly influenced by hierarchy. How this colonial society was structured and which groups existed in it will be examined in more detail in the next chapter. Chapter 9: Missionary Work and Religion. In addition to military conquest, political administration, and economic exploitation, another factor played a central role in Spanish colonial rule: religion. For many Spaniards, the spread of the Catholic faith was not only a political goal, but also a moral justification for expansion in America. The missionary work of the indigenous population therefore became an important part of colonial society. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Spain saw itself as one of the most important Catholic powers in Europe. After the end of the Reconquista in 1492, the Spanish monarchs Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon saw themselves as defenders and promoters of the Christian faith. This religious identity also influenced colonial politics. When Spain began to conquer territories in the Americas, many people viewed this expansion as a kind of religious mission. The indigenous population was not only to be politically subjugated, but also converted to Christianity. Missionaries therefore often accompanied military expeditions or followed them shortly afterwards. Among the first religious groups to travel to America were members of various Catholic orders. The Franciscans, Dominicans, and later also the Jesuits were particularly active. These religious communities founded missions, churches, and schools in many regions of the continent. The missionaries had different tasks. On the one hand, they were to spread the Christian faith, and on the other hand, They were also to act as mediators between the Spanish authorities and the indigenous population. In some regions, they became important cultural mediators who tried to facilitate understanding between the different groups. An important center of early missionary work emerged in Mexico City, which became an important religious and political center of the Spanish colonies after the conquest of the Aztec Empire. From there, missionaries traveled to various regions to build churches and build churches. However, the missionaries faced great challenges. The religious ideas of the indigenous peoples were very different from the Christian faith. Many communities had complex religious traditions with numerous gods, rituals, and ceremonies deeply rooted in their culture. Especially in the former Aztec Empire, religion was closely linked to political and social life. Temples, priests, and religious festivals played a central role in society. For the missionaries, this meant that they did not only want to change individual beliefs, but also questioned entire cultural systems. A similar picture emerged in the area of the former Inca Empire. There, too, religion was closely linked to the political order. The capital Cusco was considered the religious center of the empire, and the Inca ruler was considered the divine representative of the sun. To accomplish their mission, the missionaries developed various strategies. They often learned the local languages in order to be able to communicate with the population. Some of them even wrote dictionaries and grammar books of indigenous languages to facilitate their work. Another approach was to erect religious buildings in symbolically important places. In many cases, churches were built on the ruins of earlier temples. This was intended to demonstrate the superiority of Christianity and at the same time appeal to the population in familiar religious places. The missionaries also tried to combine Christian festivals with existing traditions. In some regions, local customs have been incorporated into new religious celebrations. This mixture of different cultural elements led to the emergence of new religious forms. A particularly well-known example of this cultural connection is the veneration of the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico. According to legend, the Virgin Mary appeared to an indigenous man named Juan Diego in 1531. This story became an important symbol of the connection between indigenous culture and the Catholic faith. The veneration of the Virgin of Guadalupe developed over time into one of the most important religious traditions in Mexico. It shows how European and indigenous religious ideas could mix with each other. But the missionary work was not always peaceful or voluntary. In many regions, traditional religious practices have been actively suppressed. Temples were destroyed, religious figures burned, and old rituals banned. The Spanish authorities considered many indigenous beliefs to be paganism and tried to replace them with Christian teachings. Sometimes this led to conflicts or resistance within the local communities. At the same time, there were also different opinions within the church about how to deal with the indigenous population. Some missionaries criticized the violence and exploitation by Spanish settlers. One of the best-known representatives of this attitude was the Dominican monk Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas argued that the indigenous population should not be forced into Christianity by force. Instead, missionary work should take place through education and conviction. His writings led to intense discussions about the moral foundations of colonial rule. Despite such debates, the church remained closely connected to the colonial administration. Missionaries often worked with local authorities and played an important role in the daily life of the colonies. Churches became central places of social life, where people came together, exchanged information, and celebrated religious festivals. The church also had great influence in the field of education. Many of the first schools and universities in the colonies were founded by religious institutions. One of the earliest universities in America, for example, was established in Lima, where clergy played an important role in the training of officials and priests. Missionary work led to a profound religious change in America in the long term. Over the centuries, Christianity became the dominant religion in many regions of the continent. At the same time, however, many indigenous traditions have been preserved in a modified form. This mixture of European and local influences had a lasting impact on Latin America's religious culture. Many religious festivals, customs, and rituals still reflect this cultural connection today. The role of religion in the Spanish colonies was therefore complex. It was at the same time an instrument of political control, a means of cultural change, and for many people, a source of personal hope and community. While missionaries, officials, and settlers spread their ideas of religion, a new society with different social groups emerged in the colonies. Origin, ancestry, and cultural identity increasingly determine a person's position within the society. How this colonial society was structured and what social hierarchies emerged will be examined in more detail in the next chapter. Chapter 10: Society in the Colonies. With the expansion of the Spanish Colonial Empire, a completely new society emerged in America. People from different regions of the world suddenly lived in the same cities, worked in the same fields, or met in the same markets. European settlers, indigenous communities, and later also people of African descent together formed a complex social structure. However, this society was by no means equal. Instead, a system of clear hierarchies developed, which was strongly influenced by origin, ancestry, and social status. At the head of this colonial society were the so-called peninsulars. These were people of Spanish descent who had been born on the Iberian Peninsula and later came to the American colonies. Many of them held important positions in the administration, the military, or the church. Since they came directly from Spain, the Spanish crown often considered them particularly loyal. Therefore, important offices were often given to this group. Governors, high officials, or viceroys belonged to the peninsulars in most cases. Their close connection to the Spanish monarchy gave them great political influence. Below this group was another important population group, the Creoles. Creoles were people of European descent, but born in America. Many of them were descendants of Spanish settlers who had already settled in the New World in the first decades of the colonial era. The Creoles often owned land, traded, or worked in local administrations. In cities like Mexico City or Lima, they formed a wealthy and influential elite. Nevertheless, they were usually below the peninsulars in the social hierarchy. This inequality led to tensions over time. Many Creoles felt disadvantaged because they were denied access to certain political offices. Although they could be economically successful, the highest political power was usually reserved for people who came directly from Spain. In addition to these two groups, another important population group developed, the mestizos. The term refers to people of mixed ancestry, mostly from European and indigenous ancestors. Through the encounter between different cultures, many families with different ethnic backgrounds were created over time. The mestizos soon formed a large part of the population in many regions of Latin America. Their social position was often between the European elite and the indigenous population. Some of them worked as craftsmen, merchants, or farmers, while others were engaged in urban professions. In colonial society, descent was often precisely categorized. A complex system of designations developed, which described various mixed forms of origin. These so-called casta categories tried to define the social order on the basis of ancestry. This system reflected the strong importance of origin and social status. People were often judged on what ancestors they had and which group they were assigned to. Such divisions influenced not only social status, but also legal opportunities, economic opportunities, and social relationships. The indigenous peoples of the Americas continued to form a large population group. Despite the dramatic population losses due to disease, wars, and forced labor, millions of people lived in the various regions of the continent. Many indigenous communities retained certain traditional structures, especially in rural areas. In some regions, they were allowed to keep their local leaders as long as they cooperated with the Spanish authorities. But the living conditions of these groups were often difficult. Many people had to pay tributes or perform work. Especially in mining areas or on large farms, the work was often hard and dangerous. In addition to European and indigenous populations, another group also played an important role, people of African descent. Many of them were brought across the Atlantic as enslaved workers and had to work in various areas of the colonial economy. The transatlantic slave trade led to numerous Africans reaching America. They were used especially on plantations or in some mining areas. Their living conditions were often extremely harsh, and many of them had very few rights. Despite these difficult circumstances, separate communities and cultural traditions developed even among enslaved people. African music, religious practices, and social structures influenced the cultural development of many regions of Latin America. The mixture of European, indigenous, and African influences led to the development of a culturally diverse society. Markets, workshops, and residential districts were created in cities, where people of different origins lived together. This diversity was particularly evident in large colonial cities. Potosi, for example, developed into one of the largest cities in the world in the 16th and 17th centuries. Spaniards, Creoles, indigenous workers, and African workers lived there in close proximity to each other. This mixture was also reflected in everyday life. Clothing, food, language, and music were influenced by different cultural traditions. Many cities developed their own character, combining both European and American elements. The church also played an important role in the social life of the colonies. Religious festivals, processions, and church services were important events that brought together people from different social groups. At the same time, society remained strongly hierarchically organized. Wealthy Spanish families often lived in large houses in the center of the cities, while poorer populations lived in simpler neighborhoods or in the countryside. Education was also unevenly distributed. Schools and universities were usually only open to certain social groups. Nevertheless, educational institutions emerged over time that played an important role in the development of colonial society. One of the first universities in America, for example, was founded in Lima. Such institutions trained civil servants, clergymen, and lawyers, who later took on important functions in the colonial administration. Despite the clear social hierarchies, however, colonial society was not completely rigid. Some people were able to achieve social advancement through trade, education, or military achievements. Especially in growing cities, new economic opportunities are offered. But the fundamental differences between the social groups remained. Origin, ancestry, and skin color continued to strongly influence what opportunities a person had in the colonial system. This social structure shaped life in the Spanish colonies for many generations. It influenced not only economic and political relations, but also cultural developments. At the same time, the encounter between different cultures led to an intensive exchange of ideas, traditions, and ways of life. European, indigenous, and African influences mixed and created new cultural forms that are still visible in many regions today. This cultural exchange, with all its conflicts and connections, is one of the most formative features of colonial history. How these cultural encounters affected language, art, science, and everyday life will be examined in more detail in the next chapter. Chapter 11: Culture and Exchange. The emergence of the Spanish colonial empire led not only to political changes and economic exploitation, but also to an intense exchange between different cultures. People from Europe, America, and Africa met in cities, at markets, in churches, and on farms. These encounters changed language, religion, nutrition, art, and everyday life on both sides of the Atlantic. The colonial era was therefore not only an era of conquest, but also a time of profound cultural mixing. When Spanish sailors and settlers came to America in the 16th century, they brought their own cultural traditions with them. These included language, religion, clothing, architecture, and social norms. At the same time, they encountered societies that already had long-developed cultural systems. In many regions of America, complex cultures existed with their own languages, religious ideas, and political structures. Particularly impressive were the civilizations of the Aztecs and Incas, whose centers were in Tenochtitlan and Cusco. These cities were cultural centers with temples, markets, and administrative systems. When the Spanish conquered these regions, they first tried to dominate their own culture. The Spanish language became the official language of administration, and the Catholic faith was to become the most important religion. But despite these attempts, the cultural reality remained more complex. Many indigenous traditions did not disappear completely, but adapted to the new conditions. In many regions, European and local cultural elements were mixed. This mixture is often referred to as cultural syncretization. A particularly visible area of this cultural encounter was architecture. Spanish colonial cities were often planned according to European models. A central square, the so-called Plaza Mayor, formed the heart of the city. Most of the most important buildings, such as the cathedral, the town hall, and the houses of the wealthy families, were located there. However, although these cities were built according to European plans, they often also reflected local influences. Indigenous craftsmen worked on the construction of churches and public buildings. This gave rise to architectural forms that combined European architectural styles with local materials and artistic traditions. An example of such a city is Lima, which was founded in the 16th century and quickly became an important cultural center of Spanish South America. Churches, universities, and administrative buildings shaped the cityscape, while at the same time local cultural elements were preserved. Mexico City, which was built on the ruins of the former Aztec capital, also developed a unique mix of different cultural influences. Spanish cathedrals stood next to buildings whose foundations date back to pre-Columbian times. In addition to architecture, language also played an important role in cultural exchange. Spanish became the dominant language in administration, commerce, and the church. But many indigenous languages remain widespread in everyday life. Missionaries often learned local languages to make their religious messages understandable. Some of them even wrote dictionaries and textbooks to document these languages. As a result, languages such as Nahuatl or Quechua were recorded in writing and in some cases preserved for centuries. Another important area of cultural exchange was nutrition. With the connection between Europe and America, a global exchange of plants and food began, which permanently changed the diet of many people. Plants from America made their way to Europe and later spread worldwide. Corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and cocoa were particularly important. These foods gradually became important components of European cuisine. At the same time, the Europeans brought new plants and animals to America. Wheat, sugarcane, and various types of fruit were grown in many regions. Animals such as horses, cattle, and pigs were also introduced, changing the agriculture and mobility of many societies. The introduction of the horse, for example, had a major impact on some indigenous cultures in North America, as it enabled new forms of hunting and locomotion. In other regions, cattle and sheep became important components of colonial agriculture. There were also new developments in the field of art. Artists in the colonies combined European painting techniques with local motifs and symbols. Religious paintings, sculptures, and murals were created that contained both Christian themes and indigenous influences. Many churches have been decorated with elaborate paintings and carvings created by local artists. These works often reflect a mixture of European styles and regional traditions. Music was another area in which various cultural influences were combined. European instruments and musical forms were introduced to the colonies, while at the same time indigenous and African rhythms were preserved. In some regions, new musical traditions emerged that combined elements from different cultures. Drums of African origin, indigenous melodies, and European instruments could be used together in religious or festive contexts. Clothing and everyday objects also reflected this cultural mix. Spanish fashion influenced the clothing of colonial elites, while indigenous communities often retained traditional clothing. At the same time, new styles of clothing emerged that combined elements from different cultural traditions. A particularly interesting example of cultural exchange was the development of new religious festivals. Christian holidays were often combined with local customs. In many regions, religious celebrations emerged that included both Catholic traditions and indigenous rituals. However, these cultural encounters were not always harmonious. In many cases, Spanish authorities and missionaries tried to suppress certain indigenous practices. Traditional rituals or religious symbols were sometimes banned or destroyed. Despite such attempts, many communities managed to adapt and continue their cultural traditions. Indigenous symbolism could appear in Christian representations, for example, or traditional rituals were integrated into new religious festivals. African traditions also survived in many regions despite the difficult conditions of slavery. Music, dance, and religious practices of African origin were preserved in some communities and influenced the cultural development of the colonies. Over the centuries, a society developed that was characterized by cultural diversity. Cities, markets, and religious festivals became places of exchange where people of different origins came into contact with each other. This cultural exchange had long-term effects. Many traditions that are widespread in Latin America today arose during these colonial encounters. Language, cuisine, music, and religious customs still reflect the mixture of different cultural influences. But despite these cultural connections, colonial society remained marked by tensions. Political inequalities, economic exploitation, and social hierarchies repeatedly led to conflicts. In various regions of America, uprisings and resistance movements against Spanish rule occurred over time. Some of these conflicts were led by indigenous communities, others by groups within colonial society. These conflicts and forms of resistance show that the colonial order was by no means accepted by everyone. How these resistances developed and what role they played in the history of the Spanish colonies will be examined in more detail in the next chapter. Chapter 12: Conflicts and Resistance. Although the Spanish colonial empire controlled large parts of the Americas for a long time, this rule was never completely stable. Behind the seemingly solid political order were numerous tensions and conflicts. Different groups within colonial society had their own interests, and many people were dissatisfied with the existing order. As a result, there were repeated resistances, uprisings, and political disputes that challenged the Spanish Empire. An important reason for these conflicts was the way Spain governed its colonies. Political power was largely in the hands of civil servants who came directly from Spain. These so-called peninsulars were often given important offices in the administration, military, and church. For many Creoles, people of Spanish descent who were born in America, this meant a significant disadvantage. Although Creoles were often economically successful and owned large estates or trading enterprises, they had limited access to the highest political positions. This inequality led to growing resentment over time. Many Creoles began to question Spain's political dominance. But tensions did not only arise within the European population. The indigenous communities of the Americas were particularly hard hit by the consequences of colonial rule. Many of them had lost their political independence, had to pay tributes, or were obliged to work. These burdens led to resistance in various regions. Indigenous communities have repeatedly tried to defend their rights or to defend themselves against the colonial order. Some of these movements remained localized, while others took on larger proportions. A particularly important uprising occurred in the 18th century in the area of the former Inca Empire. The leader of this uprising was Tupac Amaru II, a man of indigenous descent who considered himself a descendant of the Inca rulers. In 1780, Tupac Amaru II began a rebellion against the Spanish colonial government in the territory of present-day Peru. His movement was directed against high taxes, forced labor, and the power of the colonial authorities. Many indigenous farmers and workers joined his uprising. In the beginning, the movement was successful and quickly gained support in various regions of the Andes. But the Spanish government reacted with military force. After several battles, the uprising was finally crushed, and Tupac Amaru II was publicly executed. Despite its failure, this uprising remained an important symbol of resistance to colonial rule. It showed that Spanish control over their American possessions was by no means undisputed. There were also conflicts in other regions. In Mexico, for example, indigenous communities often protested against high tributes or against the loss of their land. Some of these protests developed into open uprisings against local authorities. Another example of resistance was so-called maroon communities. These were groups of runaway enslaved people of African descent who settled in remote regions and founded independent communities there. These communities often originated in hard-to-reach areas, such as forests or mountains. There they tried to build a life outside colonial control. Sometimes there were armed conflicts between these groups and colonial troops. In addition to such open uprisings, there were also more subtle forms of resistance. Some people resisted the colonial order through everyday actions. They refused to perform work, hidden resources, or adhered to traditional cultural practices. Religious practices could also be a form of resistance. Although missionaries tried to spread the Catholic faith, many indigenous communities retained parts of their original religious traditions. These were sometimes practiced secretly or combined with Christian symbols. However, conflicts did not only arise between the colonial government and oppressed population groups. There were also power struggles within the Spanish colonial administration itself. An example of this was rivalries between local governors, viceroys, and ecclesiastical authorities. Since the colonies were far away from Spain, local officials often had a lot of room for maneuver. This situation sometimes led to corruption or abuse of power. The Spanish crown tried to limit such problems through various control mechanisms. Civil servants had to send regular reports to Spain, and after the end of their term of office, they were frequently checked. Nevertheless, it was not always possible to completely prevent abuse of power. Another area of conflict was trade. Spain tried to strictly control trade with its colonies. Officially, goods could only be transported through certain ports, and all trade activities were subject to state supervision. But this system often led to smuggling. Merchants in the colonies tried to secretly exchange goods with other European powers in order to make higher profits. British and Dutch traders in particular were active in some regions. These illegal trade networks partially undermined the Spanish economic system. At the same time, they showed that control over the vast colonial territories could not always be fully enforced. International conflicts also influenced the situation in the colonies. Spain was repeatedly involved in wars with other powers in Europe. These conflicts often had a direct impact on the American possessions. Enemy fleets occasionally attacked Spanish ships or colonial cities, while pirates and buccaneers raided trade routes and tried to intercept the valuable silver transports. Cities on the Caribbean coast were particularly affected by such attacks. Port cities therefore had to be protected with fortresses and defensive structures to defend themselves against possible attacks. All these conflicts showed that the Spanish colonial empire, despite its size and power, was constantly facing challenges. Different groups within society had their own interests, and not all accepted the existing order. Over time, these tensions led to ever greater political changes. Especially in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, many people in the colonies began to think about new political ideas. The Enlightenment, revolutions in Europe, and new ideas of freedom and self-determination also influenced the American colonies. Creoles, merchants, intellectuals, and military men began to think about a future in which the colonies would no longer be ruled by Spain. These developments would eventually lead to a series of revolutions that ushered in the end of the Spanish colonial empire in America. But before these independence movements could emerge, Spain first had to deal with a new challenge: growing competition from other European powers that also wanted to gain influence in America. How these international rivalries influenced the Spanish Empire will be examined in more detail in the next chapter. Chapter 13: Competition between the European powers. While Spain had built up one of the largest colonial empires in the world in the 16th century, this supremacy did not go unchallenged. Other European powers watched developments in America closely and quickly recognized the economic opportunities offered by the new territories. Riches from silver, gold, sugar, tobacco, and other raw materials made the American colonies an important target for international competition. Over time, other European states began to gain influence in America and challenge Spanish dominance. Spain's main rivals included England, France, and the Netherlands. These states initially had fewer opportunities to build large colonial empires, as Spain and Portugal had already claimed many territories in the early age of discovery. Nevertheless, they were looking for ways to participate in America's trade and resources. One of the first forms of this competition appeared on the world's oceans. Spanish ships regularly transported large quantities of silver from American mines to Europe. These transports were extremely valuable, but also endangered. Traders, pirates, and so-called buccaneers tried again and again to attack these ships and capture their cargo. A famous representative of these buccaneers was Francis Drake, an English navigator who attacked several Spanish ships in the 16th century. Drake was supported by the English crown and was considered a hero in England, while Spain considered him a pirate. Such attacks made it clear that Spanish control of the trade routes was not completely secure. The Spanish crown responded with a new system to protect its ships. Merchant fleets were organized, which sailed together across the Atlantic and were accompanied by armed warships. These fleets transported goods between Spain and the American colonies. An important port in Spain was Seville, where many of these trade trips were organized. On the American side, port cities such as Veracruz played a central role. Despite these protective measures, competition on the world's oceans remained intense. Other European powers increasingly began to establish their own colonies in America. England, for example, established settlements on the east coast of North America, while France established colonies in Canada and the Caribbean. The Netherlands, which had broken away from Spanish rule in the 16th century, also developed a great interest in international trade. Dutch traders and seafarers established trading bases and colonies in various parts of the world, including America. The Caribbean in particular became a region of intense competition. The islands offered favorable conditions for the cultivation of sugarcane, which was in great demand in Europe. France, England, and the Netherlands founded their own colonies there, which became important centers of sugar production. These new colonies led to strong economic competition. While Spain had long sought to tightly control trade with its colonies, other powers developed more flexible trade networks. Traders from different countries exchanged goods through official and unofficial channels. Smuggling played an important role in this. Many merchants in the Spanish colonies traded secretly with foreign merchants in order to obtain better prices or larger quantities of goods. These activities weakened the Spanish trading system and showed that economic control over long distances was difficult. In addition to economic competition, there were also military conflicts between European powers. Wars in Europe often had a direct impact on the colonies in America. For example, when Spain fought against England or France in Europe, colonial possessions also became possible targets. In the Caribbean, there have been repeated attacks on Spanish cities and ports. Pirates and buccaneers attacked merchant ships or tried to plunder colonial cities. To protect itself against such attacks, Spain began to fortify its most important port cities more strongly. Cities such as Havana or Cartagena de Indias were given massive fortifications that were intended to make attacks more difficult. Some of these defenses are still preserved today and are a reminder of the time of intense colonial rivalries. Another example of competition between European powers was the struggle for trade routes in the Pacific. Spain had access to the Pacific through its colonies in the Americas and conducted an important trade with Asia. Especially the connection between Mexico and the Philippines was of great importance. Spanish ships sailed regularly between the city of Acapulco and Manila. This route allowed for the exchange of silver from America for Asian goods such as silk, spices, and porcelain. Other European powers also tried to gain access to these trade networks. Traders from England and the Netherlands were looking for ways to expand trade in the Pacific or intercept Spanish ships. At the same time, the political balance of power in Europe also changed. Spain, which had been dominant in the 16th century, was increasingly confronted with economic and military problems in the 17th and 18th centuries. Several wars put a strain on the Spanish economy, and the administration of the vast colonial empire became increasingly difficult. At the same time, the economic and military capabilities of other European states grew. France and England developed strong merchant fleets and expanded their colonial empires in different parts of the world. These developments led to Spain gradually losing influence. Nevertheless, the Spanish colonial empire remained one of the largest in the world for a long time. Large parts of Central and South America remained under Spanish control, and cities such as Mexico City or Lima remained important centers of colonial administration. But the increasing competition and political changes in Europe had long-term consequences. Economic difficulties, military conflicts, and social tensions within the colonies began to weaken the stability of the Spanish Empire. At the same time, new political ideas were spreading in Europe. Concepts such as freedom, self-determination, and national sovereignty gained in importance. These ideas were later to have a great influence in the American colonies as well. The combination of international competition, economic challenges, and new political ideas prepared the ground for a profound change in the colonial world. In the course of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Spanish colonial empire slowly began to disintegrate. The developments that led to this decline are the focus of the next chapter. Chapter 14: The Decline of the Spanish Colonial Power. For more than 2 centuries, Spain had controlled one of the largest colonial empires in the world. From Mexico to large parts of South America to islands in the Caribbean, an empire spanned enormous resources and a large population. Cities such as Mexico City and Lima developed into important political and economic centers of Spanish rule in America. But despite this impressive expansion, the Spanish colonial empire began to weaken increasingly in the course of the 18th century. The decline of the Spanish colonial power had several causes. Economic problems, political changes in Europe, social tensions in the colonies, and new ideas about freedom and self-determination all contributed to the empire's gradual loss of stability. An important factor was the economic situation of Spain itself. Although enormous quantities of silver were transported to Europe from American mines, Spain was not able to fully convert this wealth into stable economic development in the long term. A large part of the precious metal was used to finance wars in Europe or to pay off debts. Over time, the influx of silver also led to inflation. Prices rose while the Spanish economy grew only slowly in other areas. At the same time, other European countries developed economically faster and built up strong merchant fleets and industries. These changes led to Spain increasingly losing influence in international competition. Countries such as England, France, and the Netherlands developed powerful trading empires and competed successfully with Spain for markets and resources. The administration of the colonies also became increasingly difficult. The Spanish colonial empire encompassed vast territories with different cultures, landscapes, and economic structures. Decisions from Europe often had to be implemented over long distances, which required time and organization. In order to improve administration, Spain carried out a series of reforms in the 18th century. These reforms were introduced under the rule of the Bourbons, a new dynasty on the Spanish throne. Especially under Charles III of Spain, the crown tried to strengthen control over the colonies and organize the economy more efficiently. These so-called Bourbon reforms aimed to better collect taxes, centralize administration, and modernize trade. New administrative structures were created, and the crown tried to fight corruption. But although these reforms were partially successful, they also had unexpected consequences. Many people in the colonies felt more controlled or economically burdened by the new rules. The Creole elite in particular was increasingly dissatisfied with Spain's politics. Creoles, people of Spanish descent who were born in America, played an important role in the economy and society of the colonies. They owned land, traded, and often had great local influence. Nevertheless, the highest political positions were often reserved for civil servants who came directly from Spain. This inequality led to growing frustration among Creoles. Many of them began to emphasize their own identity and distance themselves from Spain. In addition to these political tensions, new political ideas developed in the 18th century that influenced the thinking of many people. The Enlightenment, an intellectual movement in Europe, challenged traditional notions of power and domination. Philosophers argued that political power should not come from kings or nobles alone, but from the people themselves. Ideas about freedom, equality, and individual rights spread to many parts of the world. These ideas also reached the Spanish colonies in America. Traders, students, and civil servants brought books and new ideas from Europe. In cities such as Mexico City or Buenos Aires, intellectuals discussed political reforms and new social models. Another important influence was the American Revolution in the late 18th century. When the British colonies in North America broke away from Britain and formed the United States, it showed many people in Latin America that colonial rule could indeed be ended. The French Revolution of 1789 also had a great influence on the political discussion in the colonies. The ideas of freedom, equality, and civil rights spread quickly and inspired many people to think about political change. While these ideas gained more and more supporters, Spain itself was shaken by political crises. A particularly decisive event was the invasion of Spain by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1808. Napoleon forced the Spanish King Ferdinand VII to abdicate and instead placed his own brother on the Spanish throne. This situation led to great uncertainty within the Spanish Empire. Many people in the colonies now wondered whether they should continue to follow a government that was under the control of a foreign power. In various regions, local groups began to organize their own political assemblies and to think about self-government. These developments marked a decisive turning point. The political crisis in Spain considerably weakened control over the colonies. At the same time, many people in America were already ready to demand major political changes. The combination of economic problems, political reforms, new ideas, and international events eventually led to the colonial order becoming increasingly unstable. While Spain was trying to maintain its power, new political movements were emerging in many regions of America. These movements demanded more autonomy or even complete independence from the Spanish crown. In the early 19th century, these demands would eventually lead to a series of revolutions that largely ended the Spanish colonial empire in America. The history of these independence movements and the final collapse of Spanish colonial rule form the topic of the last chapter. Chapter 15: The Independence Movements. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Spanish colonial empire was in a deep crisis. Political unrest in Europe, economic problems, and growing tensions within the American colonies had severely weakened the stability of the empire. For several centuries, Spain had controlled large parts of the Americas, but now movements began to emerge in many regions demanding a fundamental change: independence from the Spanish crown. A decisive trigger for these developments was the political situation in Spain itself. In 1808, the country was occupied by troops of the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon forced the Spanish King Ferdinand VII to give up the throne and installed his brother as ruler. This situation led to great confusion within the Spanish Empire. Many people in the American colonies asked themselves to whom they actually owed loyalty. If the rightful king no longer ruled, could the colonies continue to be controlled by Spain? In various cities of America, local elites began to organize political gatherings. These so-called juntas declared that they would temporarily take over political power until the situation in Spain was resolved. But in many cases, these assemblies quickly developed into centers of political independence movements. One of the first regions in which such movements arose was the territory of present-day Venezuela. There, a young military man and political thinker emerged who would later become one of the most famous figures in Latin American history: Simón Bolívar. Bolívar came from a wealthy Creole family and was strongly influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment. He believed that the American colonies had the right to determine their own political future. His goal was to end Spanish rule and create independent states in South America. However, the road to independence was long and difficult. In many regions, armed conflicts broke out between revolutionary movements and Spanish troops. These wars often lasted several years and claimed numerous victims. In North-South America, Bolívar led several military campaigns against the Spanish colonial armies. After many setbacks, he finally managed to achieve important victories. Particularly significant was the Battle of Boyaca in 1819, which paved the way for Colombia's independence. Bolívar played a decisive role in the liberation of several countries. Under his leadership, territories of present-day Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru and Bolivia gained their independence from Spain. Parallel to these developments, a strong independence movement also emerged in Mexico. There, the struggle against Spanish rule began in 1810, when the priest Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla called for an uprising against the colonial government. Hidalgo gave a famous speech that later became known as the Grito de Dolores. In this speech, he called on the population to rise up against Spanish rule. Thousands of people followed his call and joined the movement. The uprising spread quickly, but the Spanish authorities responded with military force. Hidalgo was eventually captured and executed. Nevertheless, his movement had given a decisive impulse. In the years that followed, other leaders continued the struggle. One of them was José María Morelos, who was also a priest and played an important role in the Mexican independence movement. After long struggles, Mexico finally achieved its independence from Spain in 1821. This created one of the largest new states on the American continent. Independence movements also emerged in the southern regions of South America. The Argentine General José de San Martín played a central role there. San Martín led a revolutionary army across the Andes to fight Spanish troops in Chile and Peru. This military action was one of the most impressive operations of the Latin American Wars of Independence. In 1818, Chile achieved its independence, and shortly afterwards the struggle for the liberation of Peru began. Finally, San Martín and Bolívar met in the city of Guayaquil in 1822 to discuss the future of the South American liberation movements. After this meeting, San Martín left Bolívar in charge of the further military campaigns. Bolívar continued the fight and contributed decisively to the final defeat of Spanish troops in South America. The decisive battle took place in 1824 at Ayacucho. There, the revolutionary forces defeated the Spanish army, effectively ending Spanish rule on the South American mainland. After these events, several new independent states emerged. Countries such as Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, and Argentina developed their own political systems and began to shape their national identities. There were also political changes in Central America. Several regions declared their independence and initially formed a common federation before later becoming their own states. For Spain, these developments meant a dramatic loss. Within a few decades, the country lost most of its American colonial empire. Only a few islands in the Caribbean, including Cuba and Puerto Rico, initially remained under Spanish control. The independence movements fundamentally changed the political map of America. New states emerged, which now had to shape their own political future. But the challenges were great. Many of these young nations faced difficult tasks. They had to build stable governments, solve economic problems, and connect different social groups. In some regions, political conflicts or civil wars broke out after independence. Despite these difficulties, the independence movements marked a decisive turning point in American history. The centuries-long colonial rule of Spain had ended, and new nations began to develop their own identity. However, the history of the Spanish colonies left long-term traces. Language, religion, cultural traditions, and social structures were strongly influenced by the colonial past. Many of these influences are still visible in Latin American societies today. The emergence and collapse of the Spanish colonial empire show how strongly historical developments can change the world. From the first voyages of discovery to the conquest of great empires to the revolutions of the 19th century, a history spans that connects several continents. This marked the end of the history of the Spanish colonies, an era full of encounters, conflicts and changes, the effects of which can still be felt today.